Hey Village, Tony here. So glad to be joining you for this week's installation of the weekly recap. This past Sunday, Pastor Paul introduced a new sermon series titled Liturgy of the Ordinary, going over how the rhythms of our everyday ordinary lives can actually be a form of worship. And so the first sermon in this collection of sermons was on the topic of loneliness. Now, loneliness is something that most of us, if not all of us, have grappled with during the season of COVID. As the pandemic still rages on, you and I are coming up and out of our isolation and trying to come to grips and to terms with what it means to still be in the midst of a pandemic, but not necessarily need to socially isolate or distance ourselves anymore. If we are aware, we might even see that the loneliness that we experience is not necessarily alleviated only by the presence of others. That while being around other people may help and assist in us in our facing of our loneliness, truthfully, the truth of the matter is that loneliness is present within our daily lives, regardless of how many people we may be around, how many events we may now be able to attend, how many shows we are watching, how many social media apps we are active on. As Pastor Paul said, we can scroll through TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, but for all of that social media that we consume, that's all that it is. Media, not necessarily relationship. You see, loneliness can be a terrible, weighty burden. Loneliness can be quite difficult to bear. But loneliness also can be a part of our formative journey. Loneliness can be a part of our being made into disciples of Jesus. Think about it this way, as Pastor Paul quoted the pastor and theologian Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen said that loneliness within our lives requires a gentle, patient prodding, cultivation, to turn it into a garden of solitude. Think about it as loneliness, not as a curse to bear or a burden to endure, but as an invitation to be intimate and familiar with the most human aspect of our lives. Loneliness clues you and I in to the greatest need that we may have, a need that we can't sustain or supply by ourselves. Loneliness clues you and I in to who we've been made to be, because we've been made to be a people, a person of relationships to one another, but primarily and most importantly, a person, a creature of relationship with God. You see, as Jesus, as fully God and fully man, as somebody who was most intimate with the experiences of our human existence, he himself experienced loneliness. Think about the garden in Gethsemane. I was meeting with a church member this week, talking through baptism. And we were talking about how Jesus, even in the garden, experienced a profound loneliness despite being surrounded by his closest friends, being surrounded by Peter. Jesus says to Peter, "Could you not even keep watch with me for 1 hour?" Jesus experiences profound, deep, and dark loneliness. But then he turns to the Father and says, "Not my will, but your will be done." And this doesn't mean that Jesus was being coerced into doing something he didn't want to do, but rather he was expressing the fullest cry of the human heart. that oftentimes you and I struggle with doing what God calls us to do, and instead we do what would temporarily satisfy our needs. And therefore, loneliness clues us in to how the needs we have of our lives can often lead us to consume things that don't satisfy and distract ourselves from the patient invitation of God to be satisfied by our encounter with Him. And so Jesus in the garden cultivates his loneliness, patiently and gently cultivates his loneliness into a place of solitude where he encounters God, and he encounters the life-giving and life transformation made available by the Spirit in the garden of solitude through patiently cultivating his loneliness, whether it be through prayer, through community. And so this gives you and I a great formation pathway for you and I to encounter our own loneliness and patiently transform it and cultivate it into an opportunity for solitude. So would you think about what it means for you to befriend your loneliness in your DNA groups or in your alone time? Would you think about what it means for you and I to not be victims of loneliness, but to be stewards of loneliness and to patiently transform our loneliness into opportunities of encounter and witnessing God's gracious and miraculous movement towards us? So grateful for God's patience with us. And so would we emulate that patience in our own lives as we befriend our loneliness and plug into our community, as well as being present to the move and the Spirit of God in our lives. Thanks so much, Village, for joining us on this weekly recap.